The twin moons of Tertia hung low in the violet sky, their soft glow casting an ethereal light over the dense forests and shimmering lakes of Xania's home planet. Tertia was a world of breathtaking beauty, with landscapes that seemed plucked from the dreams of poets and artists. The air was crisp and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers, and the distant hum of nocturnal creatures filled the night with a serene melody. But beneath this tranquil facade lay a society bound by tradition, where the lives of its inhabitants were often dictated by ancient customs and rigid hierarchies. Xania, the youngest daughter of the noble house of Varelli, stood at the edge of the grand balcony that jutted out from her family's sprawling estate. The cool night breeze played with her long silver hair, making it shimmer like strands of moonlight. Her emerald eyes, usually filled with warmth and curiosity, were now clouded with worry. She looked out over the vast expanse of the estate's grounds, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be the last time she would see her home. For most of her life, Xania had lived a life of privilege. The Varelli family was one of the oldest and most respected on Tertia, known for their wisdom and influence. From a young age, Xania had been taught the importance of duty and honor, of upholding the family's legacy. But no one had prepared her for the weight of those expectations when they came crashing down upon her. Her engagement to Crodor, the son of a powerful and ruthless warlord from a neighboring planet, had been arranged with little regard for her feelings. It was a strategic alliance, meant to solidify the Varelli family's power and secure their position in the ever-shifting political landscape of the galaxy. Xania had known her fate was not hers to decide, but the reality of it had been a bitter pill to swallow. Crodor was everything Xania feared in a man. He was tall and imposing, with cold, calculating eyes that saw everyone around him as mere tools for his ambition. His reputation as a merciless conqueror had spread across the stars, and stories of his cruelty sent shivers down the spines of those who spoke his name. He was a man who thrived on power and control, and Xania knew that in his hands she would be little more than a prisoner. The thought of being trapped in a loveless marriage, of being stripped of her freedom and identity, was unbearable. Xania had always been a free spirit, with a love for exploration and adventure. As a child, she would often sneak out of the estate to wander through the forests, to swim in the lakes, and to lose herself in the wonders of nature. The idea of being confined to Crodor's cold, sterile fortress, of being reduced to a mere possession, filled her with dread. Xania's parents, Lord Therius and Lady Mariel, had tried to reassure her, telling her that it was her duty to the family, that she would grow to accept her new life. But Xania could see the doubt in her mother's eyes, the sadness in her father's voice. They knew, as well as she did, that this was not the life she was meant to lead. As the days leading up to the engagement ceremony passed, Xania found herself growing more desperate. She could not bring herself to accept her fate, but the thought of defying her family and their traditions seemed equally impossible. She was trapped in a web of expectations, with no clear way out. But Xania was not one to give up easily. She was determined to find a way to escape, to carve out a life for herself that was free from the shackles of duty and tradition. She began to formulate a plan, one that would require all of her cunning and bravery. It was a plan that would take her far from Tertia, far from everything she had ever known, but it was the only way to secure her freedom. On the night before the engagement ceremony, Xania made her move. She dressed in the simplest of clothes, wrapping herself in a dark cloak to blend into the shadows. She packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, a map of the nearby spaceports, and a few precious trinkets to trade for passage off the planet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slipped out of her room, moving silently through the grand halls of the Varelli estate. The estate was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each one filled with the history and grandeur of her family's lineage. Xania had spent her entire life within these walls, but now each step she took felt like a betrayal. She avoided the main corridors, where the guards and servants might spot her, instead taking the narrow servants' passages that wound through the heart of the estate. Her senses were on high alert, every creak of the floorboards, every distant footstep, sending waves of anxiety through her. After what felt like an eternity, Xania reached the outer courtyard. The night was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. She paused for a moment, taking one last look at the place she had called home for so long. A pang of sadness pierced her heart, but she pushed it aside. There was no turning back now. She moved quickly across the courtyard, keeping to the shadows, until she reached the outer gate. The gate was locked, as she had expected, but Xenia had come prepared. She had spent the last few weeks secretly studying the estate's security systems, learning how to bypass the locks and alarms. Her fingers worked deftly as she disabled the gate's sensors, her breath coming in short, nervous gasps. Finally, with a soft click, the gate swung open. Xenia slipped through, her heart pounding in her ears. She was free, but her journey was only just beginning. The nearest spaceport was several miles away, hidden deep within the forest that surrounded the estate. Xenia knew the terrain well, having explored it many times as a child, but now, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, filled her with fear. She moved quickly but carefully, her eyes darting around, alert for any sign of pursuit. The journey to the spaceport seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking her further from the safety of her home and closer to the unknown. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, their eyes glowing in the darkness, but Xenia pressed on, driven by the fear of what awaited her if she failed. At last, after what felt like hours, she reached the outskirts of the spaceport. The towering structures loomed ahead, their lights piercing the darkness like beacons. Xenia's heart raced with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was so close to freedom, but the hardest part was yet to come. The spaceport was bustling with activity, even at this late hour. Ships of all shapes and sizes were docked in the vast hangars, their crews loading and unloading cargo, preparing for departure. Xenia knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, and she could be discovered and dragged back to her fate. She kept to the shadows, moving silently through the maze of ships and equipment, her eyes scanning the area for a suitable vessel. She needed a ship that was heading far from Tertia, somewhere Cordor's reach wouldn't extend. But finding such a ship without drawing attention to herself was a daunting task. As she crept through the spaceport, Xenia's eyes were drawn to a small, unassuming ship docked near the edge of the hangar. It was not as grand or impressive as some of the other vessels, but something about it caught her attention. The ship looked well-maintained, but it lacked the markings of any official fleet or merchant group. It was a private vessel, likely belonging to an independent traveler. Xenia's heart skipped a beat. This could be her chance. She approached the ship cautiously, her eyes darting around to make sure she wasn't being watched. The ramp was down, and she could see a figure moving inside, the faint glow of a control panel illuminating the interior. Xenia hesitated for a moment, fear gripping her. This was at the moment that would decide her fate. If she was caught now, it would all be over. Taking a deep breath, Xenia steeled herself and stepped onto the ramp. The figure inside the ship turned at the sound of her footsteps, and Xenia's breath caught in her throat. The man who stood before her was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He wore a simple, utilitarian outfit, and his dark hair was tousled, as if he had been working for hours. There was a sense of calm authority about him, a quiet confidence that put Xenia on edge. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, neither moving nor speaking. Xenia could see the surprise in the man's eyes, but also a hint of curiosity. It was as if he was trying to figure out who she was and why she had appeared on his ship in the middle of the night. Finally, Xenia broke the silence. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I need your help." The man's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Xenia," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm running from someone who wants to imprison me. I need to leave this planet. Please, I'll do anything. Just help me get away." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Xenia could feel her hands shaking, the fear and desperation rising within her. She had come so far, risked everything, and now it all depended on this stranger's decision. Finally, the man nodded. "You can stay here for now," he said, his tone gentle but resolute. "But I don't want you to feel obligated to anything. We'll figure this out together." Xenia felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the realization that her journey was far from over. She had escaped one prison, only to find herself in a new and uncertain situation. But for now she was safe, and that was enough. As the ship's engines roared to life, and they lifted off from Tertia, Xenia looked out the viewport at the planet that had been her home for so long. The pain of leaving it behind was sharp, but she knew it was a pain she could bear. Because ahead of her lay freedom, and with it, the hope of a new life. And so as the stars stretched out before her, Zinnia left her old life behind, unaware of the challenges and dangers that awaited her in the vast expanse of space. But she knew one thing for certain: she would face whatever came her way with the strength and determination that had carried her this far. Her journey had just begun. The vastness of space unfurled before Xenia as she peered out from the small viewport of the ship. Stars dotted the inky blackness like a sea of distant, twinkling diamonds, each one a silent witness to the secrets of the universe. The ship hummed softly around her, its engines purring as it cut through the cosmos with a grace that belied its rugged exterior. Xenia's heart still raced from the events of the previous night, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she began to feel a small measure of safety. She had escaped Tertia, and for now she was free. But freedom, Xenia quickly realized, came with its own set of uncertainties. The man who had taken her in, the one who now guided this ship through the stars, remained an enigma to her. His initial kindness had been a lifeline, but Xenia knew better than to trust blindly. She had to understand who he was, why he had chosen to help her, and what his intentions might be. Xenia lingered at the edge of the ship's main cabin, hesitant to intrude on the space that now served as her sanctuary. The cabin was modest but functional, lined with control panels, displays, and various tools that spoke to the ship's purpose as a working vessel. The man, whom she had yet to learn anything about, was seated in the pilot's chair, his focus fixed on the star map that hovered above the console. He appeared deep in thought, his fingers moving deftly over the controls as he charted their course. Gathering her courage, Xenia took a step forward, the soft sound of her footsteps catching the man's attention. He turned to face her, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers with a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice steady and warm, but with an underlying note of caution. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than a few words, and the sound of it put her slightly at ease, though not entirely. Xenia nodded, though her unease was still palpable. "Thank you," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "for taking me in. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." The man raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "You don't need to thank me. It looked like you were in trouble, and I couldn't just leave you there. But I think it's time we talk about what happens next." His directness took her by surprise, but she appreciated it. She had been on edge for so long, always hiding behind politeness and decorum. Now here she was, in the company of a man who seemed to value plain truth over pretense. It was refreshing, but also unnerving. "My name is Luke," he continued, finally introducing himself. "I'm an independent trader, mostly. I travel from system to system, picking up odd jobs and transporting goods. I'm not aligned with any faction, and I prefer to keep it that way." Xenia listened carefully, absorbing the information. Luke's description of himself seemed straightforward, but she knew there could be more beneath the surface. She had met many people in her life who presented one face to the world while hiding their true intentions. She needed to be cautious. "I'm Xenia," she replied, though she knew he already knew that much. "I come from Tertia. My family is. Well, they're prominent there, but I couldn't stay. I had to get away." Luke nodded, his expression understanding but guarded. "And who are you running from?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Xenia hesitated. Could she trust him with the truth? Could she tell him about Credor, about the life she had been forced to flee? But what choice did she have? If Luke was to help her, he needed to know the danger they might be facing. "I was engaged," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "to a man named Credor. He's powerful, and he's cruel. He wanted to control me, to imprison me. I couldn't let that happen. So I ran." Luke's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Credor's name. Xenia could see that he recognized it, and that recognition sent a chill down her spine. "Credor," Luke repeated, his tone darker now. "I've heard of him. He's bad news, very bad news." Xenia's heart sank. She had hoped that perhaps Credor's influence didn't extend as far as she feared, that maybe she could disappear in the vastness of space without looking over her shoulder. But Luke's reaction told her otherwise. "What are you planning to do?" Luke asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "You must have some idea of where you want to go." Xenia shook her head, the uncertainty weighing heavily on her. "I don't know," she admitted, the desperation creeping back into her voice. "I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and him as possible. But now, I'm not sure. I don't know where I can go where he won't find me. Luke leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be considering their options, weighing the risks and the possibilities. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone more resolved. "I can help you," he said, his words deliberate. "But we need to be smart about this. Credor has resources, connections. If he's really determined to find you, it won't be easy to stay ahead of him. But I've been flying these routes long enough to know a few places where we could lay low for a while." Xenia felt a glimmer of hope at his words. Luke was offering her more than just a temporary refuge, he was offering her a way to survive, to evade Credor's grasp. But she also knew that this meant she was placing her fate in his hands, and that was not a decision to be made lightly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. It was something she needed to know, something that had been gnawing at her since the moment he had agreed to take her on board. "You don't even know me. Why take the risk?" Luke's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time Xenia saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal, but then he sighed and looked away, out into the endless void of space. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when people like Credor get their way," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a bitterness that hinted at past scars. "And I've had enough of standing by and watching it happen. You needed help, and I was in a position to give it. That's all there is to it." His answer was honest, and Xenia could sense the pain behind his words. Whatever had driven Luke to live the life of a solitary space traveler, it was clear that he had his own demons to contend with. And perhaps, in helping her, he was also trying to atone for something in his past. Xenia nodded slowly, accepting his explanation. She still didn't know the full story behind Luke's motivations, but she could sense that he was someone she could trust at least for now. And right now, trust was all she had to hold on to. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steadier now, as if the conversation had helped her regain some of her composure. Luke turned back to the controls, his expression more determined. "We need to get as far from Tertia as possible, as quickly as possible. There are a few remote systems I know of, places where Credor's influence might not reach. We'll head there first and figure out our next steps from there." Xenia watched as he worked the controls, plotting their course with a precision that spoke of years of experience. The ship responded to his commands with a smoothness that was almost comforting, as if it, too, understood the urgency of their situation. As the stars outside the viewport shifted and the ship accelerated, Xenia felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear still lingered in the pit of her stomach, but it was tempered by a growing sense of hope. She was no longer alone, no longer helpless. Luke had given her a chance to escape, to survive, and perhaps even to reclaim her life. But as she settled into the co-pilot's seat beside him, Xenia knew that their journey was only just beginning. The vastness of space offered both refuge and danger, and with Credor's shadow looming over them, they would need to be vigilant at every turn. For now, though, Xenia allowed herself a moment of calm. She glanced over at Luke, who was focused on the star map ahead, his brow furrowed in concentration. Despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, there was a quiet strength in him that reassured her. "Thank you, Luke," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Luke glanced at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "We'll get through this, Xenia. We'll figure it out together." And with those words they hurtled deeper into the unknown, leaving behind the world they had both once known and stepping into a future that was as uncertain as the stars themselves. But Xenia felt a spark of hope igniting within her, a hope that, with Luke by her side, she might just find the freedom and peace she had been searching for. As the ship sailed through the endless expanse of space, Xenia closed her eyes and let herself imagine the possibilities. The universe was vast, and somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Credor and the shadows of her past, was a place where she could start anew. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had already taken the first step toward finding it. The ship's low hum was a constant presence, a steady heartbeat in the background as Xenia began to adjust to her new reality. The first few days aboard the ship were marked by a quiet tension, a delicate dance of boundaries and unspoken questions between her and Luke. They were two strangers thrust together by circumstance, each carrying the weight of their own pasts, yet now intertwined in a shared future, however uncertain it might be. Xenia spent much of her time in the small quarters Luke had shown her when she first boarded. It was a modest room, barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed tucked into one corner and a small storage unit for her belongings. The walls were bare, the metal surfaces cold to the touch, but it was a space she could call her own, a place where she could find some measure of solitude. As the days passed, Xenia's mind often wandered back to Tertia, to the life she had left behind. She thought of her family, of her parents, and wondered what they must think of her now. Had they discovered her absence yet? Were they worried, or were they simply relieved that she had taken the burden of defying Credor upon herself? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she forced herself to push those thoughts aside. There was no going back now, and dwelling on the past would only weaken her resolve. Her focus had to be on the present, on surviving, and on understanding the man who had become her unlikely protector. Luke was an enigma, a puzzle she could not yet piece together. He was kind, but reserved, always maintaining a careful distance. When they spoke, it was often about practical matters, where they were headed, what the next steps might be. But there was a gentleness in his actions, a quiet consideration that suggested there was more to him than the stoic front he presented. Xenia found herself drawn to him, not just out of gratitude but out of a genuine curiosity. Who was Luke, really? What had led him to this life of solitude among the stars? And what was it about her situation that had compelled him to take her in, to risk his own safety for hers? She knew she needed to find answers, not just to satisfy her curiosity, but to build the trust that would be crucial for their survival. Yet, she also sensed that Luke was not the type of man who would open up easily. It would take time and patience, and perhaps a willingness to share her own story in return. The opportunity for a deeper conversation came one evening, when the ship was cruising through a particularly desolate stretch of space. The star systems they passed were distant and sparse, their light barely reaching the ship as it sailed through the darkness. The isolation of the moment seemed to bring a sense of calm, a pause in the tension that had lingered between them. Xenia found Luke in the ship's main cabin, seated at the controls as usual. His eyes were fixed on the star map, but there was a pensive look on his face, as if his thoughts were far away. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt, but the silence between them had grown too heavy, too thick with unspoken words. "Luke," she began, her voice soft but steady, "can we talk?" He glanced up, his expression unreadable at first, but then he nodded and gestured for her to join him. She took a seat in the co-pilot's chair, the one she had cautiously avoided occupying before now. It felt like a small step toward bridging the gap between them, one that Luke seemed to notice, if the faint smile on his lips was any indication. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle but tinged with curiosity. Xenia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about why you decided to help me. I'm grateful, more than I can say, but I still don't really understand why you're doing this, why you're risking so much for someone you barely know." Luke's gaze softened, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the viewport where the stars drifted by like distant memories. "There are things in my past," he began slowly, his voice taking on a reflective tone, "things I'm not proud of. I've seen a lot of suffering, a lot of people hurt by the greed and cruelty of others. I've tried to keep my distance, to stay out of it, but there comes a point where you can't just stand by and watch anymore." He paused, as if weighing how much to reveal, and Xenia waited, sensing that this was something he didn't often talk about. "There was someone a long time ago," Luke continued, his voice quieter now. "Someone I cared about. She was taken by a man not unlike Credor. I tried to save her, but I was too late. I couldn't protect her, and I've had to live with that ever since. When I saw you, I saw someone who needed help, and I couldn't let what happened to her happen to you." Xenia felt a pang of sympathy for him, understanding now that his decision to help her had been driven by more than just a sense of duty. It was personal, a way for him to atone for a past he couldn't change. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the memories he carried, and it made her respect him even more. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you." Luke shook his head slightly, as if dismissing the sympathy. "We all have our burdens to bear, Xenia. Yours brought you here, and mine led me to help you. That's just how it is." There was a moment of silence, one that felt more comfortable than any they had shared before. Xenia could sense that Luke had opened up to her as much as he was willing to, and she was grateful for it. But she also knew that if they were going to survive this, if they were going to face the dangers ahead together, she needed to share her own story. "Credor," she began, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. He's not just powerful, he's dangerous. My family. They arranged the engagement because they thought it would protect them, solidify their alliances. But they didn't understand what kind of man Credor really is. Zinnia's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the memories flooding back with a force she hadn't expected. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself, but Luke noticed and reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," he said gently. But Zania shook her head. She needed to do this, for both their sakes. "He came to our planet under the guise of diplomacy," she continued, her voice firmer now. "But it was clear from the beginning that he was only interested in power. He saw me as a way to secure control over my family's influence, and when the engagement was announced, it was like a death sentence. I knew he wouldn't just imprison me, he would strip away everything I was. Everything I could be. Until there was nothing left but a shell." Her voice wavered, and she looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, that she wouldn't show weakness, but it was harder than she had imagined to relive those memories. Luke's grip on her arm tightened slightly, a silent show of support. "You did the right thing by running," he said quietly. "You saved yourself." Zania nodded, though the guilt still lingered in her heart. "But I left so much behind. My family, I don't even know if they'll be safe from him now, and I put you in danger too, just by being here." "Don't think like that," Luke said firmly. "You didn't choose this. Credor did. And as for me, I'm a big boy. I can handle myself." His attempt at lightening the mood worked, and Zania found herself smiling despite the heavy conversation. There was something comforting about Luke's presence, a strength that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Zania admitted, her voice softer now. "But I do know that I'm glad you were the one who found me. I don't think I could have made it this far on my own." Luke's expression softened, and he offered her a small, genuine smile. "You're stronger than you think, Zania. You've already faced down more than most people ever will, and as long as we stick together, we'll find a way to keep you safe." Zania felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had been alone for so long, even when she was surrounded by people on Tertia, but now she had someone she could rely on, someone who understood her fear and was willing to stand by her. For the first time since she had fled her home, Zania felt a sense of hope. It was fragile, like a flickering flame in the darkness, but it was there and it was enough to keep her moving forward. The conversation between them became easier after that, the barriers that had stood between them slowly crumbling away. Luke began to teach her more about the ship, showing her how to operate the basic controls, how to navigate using the star maps, and how to monitor the ship's systems. Zania threw herself into learning, grateful for the distraction and eager to prove that she could be useful. They developed a routine, one that brought a sense of normalcy to their otherwise unpredictable situation. Mornings were spent running through system checks and plotting their course, while afternoons were filled with lessons and quiet conversations. Evenings were a time for rest, but also for reflection as they shared stories of their pasts, their hopes, and their fears. Zania learned that Luke had once been a soldier, a fact that didn't surprise her given his calm demeanor and the way he handled the ship with such precision. But he had left that life behind, disillusioned by the endless cycle of war and destruction. He had taken to the stars, seeking a life of peace, though it was clear that the memories of his past still haunted him. In turn, Zania told him about her childhood on Tertia, about the beauty of the planet and the freedom she had once enjoyed. She spoke of her family, of the love she had for them, even if their decisions had led to her current situation. And she spoke of her dreams of exploring the galaxy, of finding a place where she could live freely, without fear or obligation. As the days turned into weeks, Zania and Luke grew closer, their bond forged in the fires of shared experience and mutual trust. The initial awkwardness between them faded, replaced by a genuine friendship that felt both comforting and vital. They were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance, they were allies, partners in a journey that neither of them could predict. Yet, despite the growing sense of camaraderie, Zania knew that the shadow of Credor still loomed over them. The man who had driven her to flee was not one to be easily deterred, and she could feel his presence like a distant storm on the horizon, always threatening to close in. But with Luke by her side, Zania felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled her home in the dead of night. She was someone who had fought for her freedom, and who would continue to fight for it no matter what. And as the ship sailed through the endless expanse of space, Xenia allowed herself to hope that, together, they might just find a way to outrun the darkness that pursued them and to carve out a new life among the stars. A life where she could finally be free. The endless void of space stretched out before them, an expanse of darkness dotted with distant stars, each one a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of their ship within it. Yet, despite the seeming infinity around them, Xenia felt the invisible noose tightening with each passing day. Crador's presence, though unseen, was a constant specter, haunting her thoughts and dreams. The ship had traveled far from Tertia, crossing through remote star systems and skirting the edges of known space. Luke's knowledge of these lesser-known routes had kept them ahead of any pursuers so far. But Xenia knew that Crador would not give up easily. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. The first sign that they were being hunted came in the form of a transmission, an encrypted signal that Luke intercepted as they were passing through a sparsely populated system on the outskirts of a dying star. The transmission was brief, a burst of static followed by a few garbled words in a language Xenia didn't recognize, but the look on Luke's face as he decoded it sent a chill down her spine. "It's a bounty notice," Luke said, his voice grim as he scanned the message on the screen. "Someone's offering a substantial reward for your capture. Dead or alive." Xenia's breath caught in her throat. She had known this was a possibility, that Crador might resort to hiring mercenaries or bounty hunters to track her down, but hearing it confirmed brought the reality crashing down around her. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke hesitated, his eyes flicking to hers with a mixture of concern and determination. "More than most people make in a lifetime," he replied. "Enough to attract every bounty hunter and rogue in this sector." Xenia sank into the co-pilot's chair, her mind racing. The galaxy was vast, but so was the network of those who would do anything for the right price. If Crador was putting out a bounty this large, it meant he was desperate to find her, and it meant that they were in more danger than ever. "What do we do?" she asked, looking to Luke for guidance. "We need to be smarter," Luke said, his tone resolute. "We can't just keep running aimlessly. We need to find a place to lay low, somewhere out of the way, where we can't be easily found. I know a few spots, but we'll have to be careful any wrong move, and we could lead them straight to us." Xenia nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. She had been so focused on escaping Tertia, on putting distance between herself and Crador, that she hadn't fully considered what would come next. But now, with the reality of the bounty hanging over them, she knew that they couldn't run forever. They needed a plan, and they needed allies, people who could help them, or at least offer them a place to hide. "There's a planet in the Orani system," Luke continued, his fingers moving over the navigation console as he brought up a star map. "It's off the main trade routes, mostly inhabited by exiles and those who want to stay off the radar. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll buy us some time to figure out our next move." Xenia studied the map, her eyes tracing the path Luke had laid out. The Orani system was a cluster of planets orbiting a faint star, far from the bustling hubs of galactic commerce and far from the prying eyes of authorities. It was the kind of place where people disappeared either by choice or by force. "Do you trust the people there?" Xenia asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Luke's expression was cautious. "Trust might be too strong a word, but I've done business with some of them in the past. They're not the type to ask too many questions, as long as you don't cause trouble." Xenia nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. It wasn't much, but it was a plan, and right now that was all they had. As Luke plotted their course to Orani, Xenia's thoughts drifted back to Crador. She could picture him, standing in his fortress on that cold, desolate planet he called home, his eyes burning with the same intensity she had seen when they first met. Crador was not a man who took failure lightly, and the fact that she had slipped through his grasp would only fuel his obsession. The idea of facing him again filled Xenia with dread, but it also stirred something else within her, a flicker of defiance. She had escaped once, and she would do everything in her power to stay free, no matter the cost. But as the ship made its way through the stars, the shadow of Crador seemed to grow ever larger, looming over their every move. The Orani system was exactly as Luke had described, a forgotten corner of the galaxy, where the unwanted and the unwelcome found refuge. The planets were rugged, their surfaces scarred by ancient volcanic activity and pockmarked with craters from long-forgotten wars. The faint light of the system star cast a dim glow over the landscape, giving everything a desolate, almost haunting quality. As the ship descended through the atmosphere of Irani's largest planet, Xenia peered out the viewport, taking in the barren terrain below. Sparse vegetation clung to the rocky soil, and the only signs of civilization were the scattered settlements nestled in the valleys between the jagged mountain ranges. Luke guided the ship toward one of these settlements, a small cluster of buildings that seemed to huddle together for warmth in the chilly air. The settlement was rudimentary, made up of prefabricated structures and patched-together equipment, but it was alive with activity. As they approached, Xenia could see figures moving between the buildings, going about their daily lives with the kind of quiet determination that spoke of people who had learned to survive in harsh conditions. "This is it," Luke said as they touched down on a makeshift landing pad. The settlement's called Haven, though it's more out of irony than anything else. The people here are tough, and they don't trust outsiders easily, but they're also not interested in getting involved in other people's problems, which works in our favor. Xenia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to disembark. She had no idea what to expect from the people of Haven, but she knew that they needed to make a good impression if they were going to stay under the radar. As they stepped out of the ship, the cold air hit Xenia like a slap, sharp and bracing. She pulled her cloak tighter around her, glancing around at the settlement. The buildings were arranged in a loose circle, with a central courtyard that seemed to serve as the heart of the community. There was a rough beauty to the place, a sense of resilience that reminded Xenia of the wild, untamed parts of Tertia she had loved so much. The endless void of space stretched out before them, an expanse of darkness dotted with distant stars, each one a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of their ship within it. Yet, despite the seeming infinity around them, Xenia felt the invisible noose tightening with each passing day. Crador's presence, though unseen, was a constant specter, haunting her thoughts and dreams. The ship had traveled far from Tertia, crossing through remote star systems and skirting the edges of known space. Luke's knowledge of these lesser-known routes had kept them ahead of any pursuers so far. But Xenia knew that Crador would not give up easily. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. The first sign that they were being hunted came in the form of a transmission, an encrypted signal that Luke intercepted as they were passing through a sparsely populated system on the outskirts of a dying star. The transmission was brief, a burst of static followed by a few garbled words in a language Xenia didn't recognize, but the look on Luke's face as he decoded it sent a chill down her spine. "It's a bounty notice," Luke said, his voice grim as he scanned the message on the screen. "Someone's offering a substantial reward for your capture. Dead or alive." Xenia's breath caught in her throat. She had known this was a possibility, that Crador might resort to hiring mercenaries or bounty hunters to track her down, but hearing it confirmed brought the reality crashing down around her. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke hesitated, his eyes flicking to hers with a mixture of concern and determination. "More than most people make in a lifetime," he replied. "Enough to attract every bounty hunter and rogue in this sector." Xenia sank into the co-pilot's chair, her mind racing. The galaxy was vast, but so was the network of those who would do anything for the right price. If Crador was putting out a bounty this large, it meant he was desperate to find her, and it meant that they were in more danger than ever. "What do we do?" she asked, looking to Luke for guidance. "We need to be smarter," Luke said, his tone resolute. "We can't just keep running aimlessly. We need to find a place to lay low, somewhere out of the way, where we can't be easily found. I know a few spots, but we'll have to be careful any wrong move, and we could lead them straight to us." Xenia nodded, the gravity of the situation sinking in. She had been so focused on escaping Tertia, on putting distance between herself and Crador, that she hadn't fully considered what would come next. But now, with the reality of the bounty hanging over them, she knew that they couldn't run forever. They needed a plan, and they needed allies, people who could help them, or at least offer them a place to hide. "There's a planet in the Irani system," Luke continued, his fingers moving over the navigation console as he brought up a star map. "It's off the main trade routes, mostly inhabited by exiles and those who want to stay off the radar. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll buy us some time to figure out our next move." Xenia studied the map, her eyes tracing the path Luke had laid out. The Irani system was a cluster of planets orbiting a faint star, far from the bustling hubs of galactic commerce and far from the prying eyes of authorities. It was the kind of place where people disappeared either by choice or by force. "Do you trust the people there?" Xenia asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Luke's expression was cautious. "Trust might be too strong a word, but I've done business with some of them in the past. They're not the type to ask too many questions, as long as you don't cause trouble." Xenia nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. It wasn't much, but it was a plan, and right now that was all they had. As Luke plotted their course to Orani, Xenia's thoughts drifted back to Crawdor. She could picture him, standing in his fortress on that cold, desolate planet he called home, his eyes burning with the same intensity she had seen when they first met. Crawdor was not a man who took failure lightly, and the fact that she had slipped through his grasp would only fuel his obsession. The idea of facing him again filled Xenia with dread, but it also stirred something else within her, a flicker of defiance. She had escaped once, and she would do everything in her power to stay free, no matter the cost. But as the ship made its way through the stars, the shadow of Crawdor seemed to grow ever larger, looming over their every move. The Orani system was exactly as Luke had described, a forgotten corner of the galaxy, where the unwanted and the unwelcome found refuge. The planets were rugged, their surfaces scarred by ancient volcanic activity and pockmarked with craters from long-forgotten wars. The faint light of the system star cast a dim glow over the landscape, giving everything a desolate, almost haunting quality. As the ship descended through the atmosphere of Orani's largest planet, Xenia peered out the viewport, taking in the barren terrain below. Sparse vegetation clung to the rocky soil, and the only signs of civilization were the scattered settlements nestled in the valleys between the jagged mountain ranges. Luke guided the ship toward one of these settlements, a small cluster of buildings that seemed to huddle together for warmth in the chilly air. The settlement was rudimentary, made up of prefabricated structures and patched-together equipment, but it was alive with activity. As they approached, Xenia could see figures moving between the buildings, going about their daily lives with the kind of quiet determination that spoke of people who had learned to survive in harsh conditions. "This is it," Luke said as they touched down on a makeshift landing pad. The settlement's called Haven, though it's more out of irony than anything else. The people here are tough, and they don't trust outsiders easily, but they're also not interested in getting involved in other people's problems, which works in our favor. Xenia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to disembark. She had no idea what to expect from the people of Haven, but she knew that they needed to make a good impression if they were going to stay under the radar. As they stepped out of the ship, the cold air hit Xenia like a slap, sharp and bracing. She pulled her cloak tighter around her, glancing around at the settlement. The buildings were arranged in a loose circle, with a central courtyard that seemed to serve as the heart of the community. There was a rough beauty to the place, a sense of resilience that reminded Xenia of the wild, untamed parts of Tertia she had loved so much. The people of Haven were a varied group, their appearances reflecting the diverse backgrounds they had come from. Some wore the tattered remnants of military uniforms, others dressed in the utilitarian garb of miners and traders. Their eyes were wary as they watched Luke and Xenia approach, but there was no hostility, only a guarded curiosity. A woman stepped forward from the group, her presence commanding without being overtly intimidating. She was tall and lean, with weathered skin and short-cropped hair that had once been black but was now streaked with gray. Her sharp eyes flicked between Luke and Xenia, assessing them with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too much of the world. "New faces," she said, her voice a low rasp, roughened by years of breathing in the planet's thin, dusty air. "Not often we get visitors here, especially ones who come unannounced." Luke inclined his head in a gesture of respect. "We're just passing through, looking for a place to rest and resupply. We won't be any trouble." The woman's gaze lingered on Xenia for a moment, and Xenia could feel the weight of her scrutiny. This woman, whoever she was, had a way of seeing through the surface, of understanding more than what was spoken. "Name's Jessa," the woman said finally, her tone neutral. "I run things around here for the most part. You'll find we don't have much to offer, but what we do have, we don't give freely. What's your business here?" "We need a place to lay low for a while," Luke replied, not missing a beat. "We're trying to avoid some unwanted attention. We can pay for our stay, and we won't cause any problems." Jessa considered this, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of unwanted attention are we talking about?" Luke hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, but it was enough for Jessa to pick up on. Her gaze sharpened, and she crossed her arms over her chest, clearly not one to be easily fooled. "Bounty hunters," Luke said, his voice steady. "There's a price on my companion's head. We're just trying to stay out of sight until we can figure out our next move." Jessa's eyes flicked to Xania again, and for a moment, Xania feared that the woman might turn them away, might see them as too much of a risk. But then Jessa let out a slow breath, her expression softening just a fraction. "You're not the first to come here with trouble on your heels," Jessa said, her tone more measured now. "As long as you keep that trouble to yourselves and don't bring it down on our heads, you're welcome to stay. We've got a few empty quarters you can use, and there's a mess hall if you need food." Xenia felt a wave of relief wash over her, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "We won't cause any problems, I promise." Jessa nodded, though there was a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "See that you don't," she replied. "We've built something here, and we don't take kindly to outsiders who come in and disrupt that. Stay as long as you need, but keep to yourselves." With that, Jessa turned and walked away, her presence leaving a palpable weight behind. The rest of the settlers gradually returned to their activities, though Xenia could feel their eyes on her and Luke as they made their way to the quarters Jessa had indicated. The quarters were small and Spartan, with little more than a cot and a table in each room, but they were warm and dry, and that was enough for Xenia. She dropped her bag onto the cot and sat down, finally allowing herself to breathe. "We're safe for now," Luke said, leaning against the doorway, "but we need to be careful. If word gets out that we're here, this place could become a target." Xenia nodded, knowing that the danger was far from over. "Do you think Crawdor will find us?" Luke's expression was serious. "He'll keep looking, and with the bounty out there, it's only a matter of time before someone picks up our trail. But this place, it's off the grid. We might have a chance to stay hidden, at least for a while." Xenia looked around the small room, trying to imagine what life would be like here, in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. It was a far cry from the grand halls of her family's estate, from the beauty and elegance of Tertia. But it was also far from Crawdor, and that was what mattered. "We'll make it work," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We've come this far, and we'll keep going." Luke nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Xenia. Don't forget that." Xenia smiled, though there was a sadness to it. She didn't feel strong, she felt like a leaf caught in a storm, buffeted by forces beyond her control, but Luke's words gave her strength, and she clung to that. As night fell over Haven, the settlement grew quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the soft whisper of the wind against the walls. Xenia lay on the cot, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. She knew they couldn't stay in Haven forever. Eventually they would have to move on, to find a more permanent solution. But for now they had a place to rest, to gather their strength, and to plan their next move. But even as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the shadow of Crawdor remained, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. She knew he was still out there, searching for her, and she knew that this brief respite was just that, a respite. The battle was far from over, and the dangers that lay ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. But Xenia was ready. She had faced down her fears before, and she would do it again. Because no matter what came next, she would not let Crawdor take her freedom away. Not now, not ever. The days in Haven passed slowly, a mix of uneasy calm and relentless anticipation. Xenia and Luke settled into the rhythm of the settlement, doing their best to blend in, to become just another pair of drifters seeking refuge in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. But despite the semblance of normalcy, the undercurrent of tension never left. Xenia knew that their stay in Haven was only a temporary reprieve. The shadow of Crawdor loomed ever closer, and the feeling of being hunted gnawed at her daily. Luke spent most of his time working with the locals, offering his skills as a mechanic and engineer in exchange for supplies and information. He had a way of making himself useful without drawing too much attention, a skill honed over years of living on the fringes of society. Xenia, on the other hand, kept to herself, spending hours poring over the ship's star maps, looking for possible escape routes and safe havens far beyond Crawdor's reach. Despite the relative safety of Haven, Xenia felt the weight of Crawdor's pursuit pressing down on her more heavily with each passing day. Every time a new face appeared in the settlement, her heart would skip a beat, her mind racing with the fear that they had finally been found. She could see the same anxiety in Luke's eyes, though he did his best to hide it. They both knew that their time was running out. It was Jessa who first brought the news, an ominous confirmation that their fears were well-founded. Xenia was in the mess hall, nursing a cup of bitter, lukewarm tea, when Jessa approached her. The older woman's expression was as inscrutable as ever, but there was a tension in her posture that put Xenia on edge. "Words come in from one of our scouts," Jessa said, her voice low, meant for Xenia's ears alone. "A ship was spotted on the outskirts of the system, not one of ours. It's heavily armed, and it's been making inquiries." Xenia felt her stomach drop. "Inquiries about what?" Jessa's eyes narrowed, her gaze hard. "About you and the man you came here with." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Xenia's mind raced, panic clawing at her as she struggled to process what this meant. Credor had found them. It was only a matter of time before he or his agents closed in, and there would be no escaping this time. Jessa continued, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "I'm not one to ask questions, but it's clear you've brought trouble with you. I'm giving you fair warning, this place is neutral ground, but if you bring that kind of heat down on us, you'll be on your own." Xenia nodded, too overwhelmed to respond with words. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still a shock. The safety they had found in Haven had always been temporary, a fragile bubble that was now on the verge of bursting. "We won't put your people in danger," Xenia managed to say, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "We'll leave, find somewhere else." Jessa studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, she turned and left Xenia alone with her thoughts. Xenia's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table, the reality of their situation crashing over her in waves. She knew they couldn't stay in Haven any longer. They had to leave, but where could they go? The galaxy was vast, but Credor's reach was long, and the bounty on her head would ensure that they were pursued wherever they went. The only option, the only way to truly be free of Credor, was to confront him. It was a thought that had lingered at the back of her mind for some time, but now it crystallized into a terrifying certainty. They had to face Credor, to end this once and for all. She found Luke in the ship's cargo hold, where he was working on a piece of equipment that had been giving them trouble since they'd arrived. The clatter of tools and the hiss of welding filled the small space, but when Xenia entered, Luke looked up immediately, his expression turning serious at the sight of her. "We've been found," Xenia said without preamble, her voice tight with fear and resolve. Luke's hand stilled, the wrench he was holding dropping to his side. His eyes searched hers, seeing the truth in her words. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Xenia replied. "Jessa's scouts spotted a ship on the outskirts of the system. They're asking questions about us. It's only a matter of time before they close in." Luke cursed under his breath, his mind clearly racing through their options. "We need to get out of here," he said, though Xenia could hear the hesitation in his voice. "But even if we leave now, they'll track us. Credor's not going to stop until he has you." Xenia took a deep breath, the fear in her chest hardening into a cold resolve. "We can't keep running, Luke. We need to end this. We need to face Credor." Luke's eyes widened in surprise, but she could see the recognition in them as well. He had known this moment would come, just as she had. "You're talking about confronting him," he said, his voice low, as if speaking the words aloud made them more real. It's a huge risk, Xenia. You know what he's capable of." "I know," Xenia replied, her voice firm. "But we can't live like this, always looking over our shoulders, always running. He'll never stop. We need to make him stop." Luke looked at her for a long moment, weighing her words, and then he nodded slowly. "All right, but we need a plan. We can't just walk into this blind." Xenia felt a surge of relief that he was with her on this, that he wasn't trying to talk her out of it. She had been prepared to do this alone if she had to, but the thought of facing Credor with Luke by her side gave her strength. "We can't take him on directly," Luke said, pacing as he spoke, his mind clearly working through the details. "He's too powerful, too well guarded. But if we can lure him into a trap, somewhere isolated, where he won't have his full force behind him." Xenia nodded, her mind racing to keep up. "Somewhere like Haven," she said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "He thinks he's hunting us, but we could turn the tables, make him think we're vulnerable, draw him into a place where we have the advantage." Luke stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. It's risky, but it could work. We'd need to be careful, make sure everything is in place before we make our move. And we'd need to make sure the people of Haven are out of harm's way. Xania's heart pounded in her chest, the enormity of what they were planning sinking in. But it was a plan, and it was their best chance. "I'll talk to Jessa," she said. "She might not like it, but she'll understand why we have to do this. We can't let Credor keep doing this to us, or to anyone else." Luke nodded, his expression resolute. "Let's do it then. It's time to end this." The preparations for the confrontation were intense, each step bringing them closer to the moment that would determine their fate. Xania and Luke worked tirelessly, going over every detail of their plan, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. The people of Haven, led by Jessa, agreed to help, though the tension in the settlement was palpable. Jessa had been reluctant at first, wary of bringing a confrontation of this magnitude to Haven's doorstep. But she had seen the determination in Xania's eyes, had recognized the need to face down the threat that Credor represented. And so the settlement's residents began to prepare, evacuating the vulnerable and fortifying the area where the confrontation would take place. The plan was simple in its design but complex in its execution. They would create the illusion of vulnerability, allowing Credor's forces to believe that Xania and Luke were cornered and defenseless. They would lure him into a specific location, a narrow pass between two mountain ranges, where Credor's forces would be forced to funnel through a narrow choke point. It was a place where numbers and firepower would be less of an advantage, where terrain and strategy could turn the tide. Luke had spent hours rigging the pass with traps and explosives, using his knowledge of engineering to create a deadly gauntlet that would decimate any forces that tried to push through. Meanwhile, Xania worked with Jessa to organize the defenders, setting up ambush points and fallback positions. As the day of the confrontation approached, the air in Haven grew thick with tension. Xania could feel it in every breath, in every glance exchanged between the people who had become her allies in this fight. She could see it in Luke's eyes, the way he moved with a quiet intensity, his focus razor-sharp. The night before the battle, Xania found herself unable to sleep. She left the small quarters she and Luke had been sharing and stepped out into the cold night air, the chill biting into her skin, even through her cloak. The settlement was quiet, the buildings dark, but the sky above was ablaze with stars, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that gripped her heart. She walked to the edge of the settlement, where the land dropped away into a steep ravine. The wind whipped through her hair, carrying with it the distant sound of machinery and the hum of the planet's thin atmosphere. Xania wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the stars, trying to find some semblance of peace in the face of what was to come. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Luke approaching, his expression softening when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice gentle. Xania shook her head. "Too much on my mind," she admitted. "It's hard to stop thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow." Luke stepped closer, his presence warm and comforting in the cold night. "We've done everything we can to prepare," he said. "Now we just have to see it through." Xania nodded, though the fear still gnawed at her. "I keep thinking about what if something goes wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we fail? What if he—" Luke placed a hand on her shoulder, turning her to face him. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "We're not going to fail. We've come this far, and we're going to see it through to the end. No matter what happens, we're in this together." Xania felt a lump rise in her throat, the weight of his words and the sincerity in his eyes bringing tears to her eyes. She had been so afraid, so focused on the danger, that she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel the strength of the bond they had forged. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Luke smiled, a small, reassuring smile that warmed her even in the cold. "We're going to make it through this," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "And when we do, we'll finally be free." Xania nodded, a sense of calm washing over her as she held on to that thought. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by something stronger, a resolve to see this through, to fight for her freedom and for the life she wanted to build. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Xania and Luke stood together, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The sun rose on the day of the battle, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape as the defenders of Haven took their positions. The pass where the confrontation would take place was eerily quiet, the calm before the storm. Xenia could feel the tension in the air, a palpable weight that pressed down on her as she waited for the signal that Credor's forces were approaching. She was positioned on a high ridge overlooking the pass, a vantage point that allowed her to see the entire battlefield. Luke was with her, his attention focused on the control panel he had set up to trigger the traps and explosives they had planted. Below them, hidden among the rocks and crevices, the defenders lay in wait, ready to strike when the time came. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment that would decide everything. And then she saw a glint of metal in the distance, the faint outline of a ship descending toward the pass. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the ship's design, the sleek, predatory lines that were unmistakably Credor's. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. Luke nodded, his expression grim. "Stay sharp. Remember the plan." Xenia nodded, though the fear coiled in her stomach like a snake. She watched as the ship touched down at the far end of the pass, the landing ramp lowering to reveal a squad of heavily armed soldiers. They moved with the precision of trained mercenaries, fanning out to secure the area as Credor himself emerged from the ship. He was just as she remembered him, tall, imposing, with an air of cold authority that sent a shiver down her spine. His eyes swept over the pass, searching for any sign of her, and Xenia could feel his presence like a physical force, radiating menace and control. Credor's soldiers advanced cautiously, moving through the pass with weapons at the ready. They were clearly expecting resistance, but they had no idea what was waiting for them. Xenia held her breath as the first of the soldiers crossed into the choke point, the narrowest part of the pass where the walls closed in on either side. This was the moment they had planned for, the moment that would set everything into motion. Luke's fingers hovered over the control panel, his expression tense. "Wait for it," he murmured, his eyes locked on the advancing soldiers. "Wait for them to commit." Xenia nodded, her heart racing as the soldiers moved further into the pass. She could see the strain on Luke's face, the pressure of knowing that the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and they would lose their advantage. Too late, and the soldiers would have a chance to break through. And then, in a single, fluid motion, Luke pressed the button. The ground beneath the soldiers erupted in a burst of fire and smoke as the explosives detonated, sending shockwaves through the narrow pass. Rocks and debris rained down from above, blocking the path and cutting off any chance of retreat. The soldiers were thrown into chaos, their formation shattered as they scrambled for cover. But there was no cover to be found. The pass had become a death trap, the walls closing in as more explosives went off, trapping the soldiers in a maelstrom of destruction. Xenia watched in stunned silence as the plan unfolded exactly as they had envisioned. The mercenaries, caught off guard and disoriented, were easy targets for the defenders of Haven, who emerged from their hiding places to unleash a hail of gunfire. Credor's forces were being decimated, their numbers dwindling with each passing second. But Xenia knew that this was only the first phase of the plan. The real challenge would come when Credor himself entered the fray. And sure enough, as the last of the soldiers fell, Credor strode into the pass, his face twisted with fury. He was flanked by a smaller, elite guard, each one heavily armed and clearly more formidable than the mercenaries who had come before. Xenia's breath caught in her throat as she saw him, the man who had haunted her nightmares now standing within reach. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when she would finally confront the man who had tried to take everything from her. Luke's hand tightened on her shoulder, grounding her in the present. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "Stay focused." Xenia nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she had to do, but the reality of it was terrifying. She had never been a warrior, had never imagined herself in a situation like this. But she had come too far to back down now. She watched as Credor advanced, his gaze sweeping the pass with cold calculation. He was looking for her, she knew, searching for the one who had defied him, who had escaped his grasp. And then his eyes found her. Xenia felt a jolt of fear as their gazes locked, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She could see the recognition in his eyes, the anger, but also the satisfaction of finally finding his prey. Credor raised his hand, signaling his guards to hold their position. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and Xenia could feel the weight of his presence bearing down on her. "Xenia," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble." Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to look away. "You'll never have me, Credor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "I'd rather die than go back with you." Credor's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You've always been stubborn," he said, his tone almost amused. "But you've underestimated me just as your family did. You think you can hide from me, but you can't. I will always find you." Xenia's hands clenched into fists, the fear giving way to anger. "You don't own me," she said, her voice rising. "I'm not a possession, and I won't let you take my life from me." Credor's smile faded, his expression hardening. "You think you have a choice in this? You're mine, Xenia. You always have been." Xenia felt a surge of defiance, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had spent so long running, so long afraid, but now, standing face to face with the man who had tried to break her, she realized that she was no longer the same person. She had grown, had become stronger, and she would not let Credor take that from her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm. "I do have a choice, and I choose to be free." With that, Xenia raised the blaster she had been holding at her side, leveling it at Credor's chest. She saw the surprise in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold, steely resolve. Credor's hand moved toward his own weapon, but before he could draw it, a shot rang out, a single, precise shot that struck him in the shoulder, knocking him back. Xenia's heart leapt as she saw Luke standing beside her, his blaster still raised, his expression grim. "Stay down, Credor," Luke said, his voice cold as ice. "It's over." Credor staggered, blood seeping from the wound in his shoulder, but he didn't fall. His eyes blazed with fury, and for a moment Xenia thought he might try to retaliate. But then, slowly he lowered his hand, his gaze shifting from Luke to Xenia. "This isn't over," Credor said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll be back, and when I am, you'll regret ever defying me." Xenia felt a chill run down her spine at his words, but she stood her ground, her blaster still trained on him. "Leave," she said, her voice firm, "and don't ever come after me again." For a moment Credor hesitated, as if weighing his options. Then, with a sneer, he turned and signaled to his remaining guards. Together, they retreated, moving back toward their ship. Xenia watched as they boarded and the ship lifted off, disappearing into the sky. Only when the ship was out of sight did she finally lower her blaster, the adrenaline draining from her body. It was over. The confrontation they had feared and dreaded for so long was finally over. Credor was gone, and they were still standing. But even as relief washed over her, Xenia knew that this was not the end. Credor's words still echoed in her mind, a reminder that the threat had not been completely vanquished. He would return, of that she had no doubt. But when he did, she would be ready. Luke stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice soft and filled with pride. "You faced him." Xenia nodded, though she still felt the weight of what had happened pressing down on her. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, Luke, for everything." Luke smiled, a warm, genuine smile that filled her with a sense of peace. "We're in this together, Xenia. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Xenia smiled back, feeling a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. The battle was over, but their journey was far from finished. There would be more challenges ahead, more dangers to face, but she knew now that she wasn't alone. She had Luke by her side, and together, they would carve out a new life, one where they were truly free. As the sun set over Haven, casting the landscape in a warm, golden light, Xenia and Luke stood together, ready to face whatever the future might bring. And for the first time in a long time, Xenia felt a sense of peace. They had won this battle, and with it, they had won their freedom. The dust had barely settled in Haven when Xenia and Luke began to make plans for their future. The battle with Credor had left its mark on the settlement both physically and emotionally, but there was a sense of relief in the air, a collective exhale from the people who had fought so bravely. For Xenia, the victory was bittersweet. She had stood up to the man who had tormented her, had faced down her fears, but the confrontation had also solidified a truth she couldn't ignore: they couldn't stay in Haven forever. Jessa, ever the pragmatist, had been the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "You bought yourself some time," she had said, her eyes as sharp as ever. But Crador's not the kind to let this go. He'll be back, and when he comes, he won't be alone. Xania had nodded, knowing Jessa was right. The battle had been a temporary reprieve, a chance to strike back, but it wasn't the end. Crador was too powerful, too obsessed with control to let them slip away so easily. And while Haven had been a refuge, it was also vulnerable. Xania couldn't bear the thought of the people here suffering because of her. That night, after the battle, Xania and Luke had sat together in the small quarters they had been using, the room dimly lit by a single lantern. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and oil, remnants of the day's conflict, but there was also a quiet, intimate peace between them. "We need to leave," Xania had said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Haven can't be our home, not with the threat of Crador hanging over us. We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere far away from all of this." Luke had nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking the same thing," he'd admitted. "But the question is where? The galaxy's a big place, but Crador has eyes and ears in more systems than I care to count. We need to be smart about this." And so their discussions had begun, the two of them poring over star maps and data logs, considering every possible option. Luke had suggested several remote systems, places he had traveled to in the past, places off the beaten path where they might be able to disappear. Xania had listened, her heart both heavy and hopeful. The idea of starting over was daunting, but it was also a chance to build the life she had always dreamed of, a life free from fear, where she could finally be herself. After days of deliberation, they had finally settled on a destination, the Velides Cluster, a region of space on the fringes of known territory. It was a place of mystery, largely uncharted and sparsely populated, but Luke had heard rumors of habitable planets there, untouched by the conflicts and politics that plagued the core systems. It was as close to a fresh start as they could hope for. Jessa, ever the practical leader, had helped them prepare for the journey. Supplies were gathered, the ship was repaired and refueled, and word was quietly spread that Xania and Luke would be leaving. The people of Haven, who had grown accustomed to their presence, bid them farewell with a mix of relief and sorrow. Xania had made connections here, had found a strange sense of belonging among the exiles and outcasts, but she knew this wasn't her true home. Her journey wasn't over yet. The day of their departure was crisp and clear, the pale sun casting long shadows over the settlement as Xania and Luke made their final preparations. The ship, which had served as both refuge and fortress, stood ready on the landing pad, its hull gleaming in the morning light. It was time to leave, to take the next step in their journey. As they loaded the last of their supplies onto the ship, Xania felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement, anxiety, and a deep sense of finality. This was it. They were leaving behind the place that had sheltered them, the people who had fought alongside them, and venturing into the unknown. Jessa was waiting for them at the foot of the ramp, her expression as inscrutable as ever. "You've got a long journey ahead of you," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "The Velides Cluster isn't a place you go to on a whim. But you've made it this far, and I reckon you've got what it takes to see it through." Xania smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for the older woman. "Thank you, Jessa. For everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Jessa shrugged, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Just do me a favor and make sure this wasn't all for nothing. Find a place where you can be free. You both deserve that." Luke nodded, his hand resting on Xania's shoulder. "We will," he promised. "And if you ever need anything, you know how to reach us." Jessa gave them a final nod, then stepped back as they boarded the ship. The ramp closed with a hiss, sealing them inside, and Xania took a deep breath as she settled into the co-pilot's seat. Luke was already at the controls, his hands moving with practiced ease as he prepared for takeoff. "This is it," he said, glancing over at her with a smile that was both reassuring and tinged with anticipation. "You ready?" Xania nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ready." With a low rumble, the ship's engines roared to life, and they lifted off from the landing pad, the settlement of Haven growing smaller and smaller beneath them. Xania watched as the familiar landscape faded into the distance, a bittersweet farewell to the place that had been their sanctuary. As they broke through the atmosphere and into the endless black of space, Xania felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for so long began to melt away, replaced by a sense of possibility. The Velides Cluster was an unknown, but it was also a blank slate, a chance to create something new. The journey to the Velatis cluster was long and fraught with challenges. The region was largely uncharted, and they had to navigate through asteroid fields, unstable wormholes, and regions of space where the very laws of physics seemed to bend and twist. But Luke was a skilled pilot, and together, they managed to avoid the worst of the dangers. During the long stretches of travel, Xenia and Luke found themselves reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. The conversation often drifted to their pasts, to the lives they had left behind, and to the future they hoped to build. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, forged in the fires of their shared experiences. One evening, as they sailed through the tranquil expanse of a nebula, its swirling gases painting the viewport with hues of blue and purple, Xenia found herself lost in thought. The beauty of the scene was mesmerizing, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had marked so much of her life. She turned to Luke, who was sitting beside her, his gaze also fixed on the nebula. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked, her voice soft. Luke glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about what kind of life we can have out there, what it will be like to finally stop running." Xenia nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I want to build something new," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "A place where we can be free, where we can make our own choices. I don't want to live in fear anymore." Luke reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We'll find that place," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "And when we do, we'll make it our home. No one will be able to take that from us." Xenia smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. For so long she had been driven by the need to escape, to survive. But now, with Luke by her side and the Velatis cluster on the horizon, she felt something new: hope. Hope for a future where she could live on her own terms, where she could finally be free. After weeks of travel, they finally reached the Velatis cluster. The region was as remote and mysterious as they had imagined, a collection of star systems shrouded in dense nebulae and protected by natural barriers that made it difficult to access. But for Xenia and Luke, it was perfect, a place where they could disappear, where they could start over. Their ship entered the atmosphere of a planet that Luke had identified as a potential home, Velatis Prime, the largest and most habitable of the planets in the cluster. As they descended, Xenia's breath caught in her throat. The planet was breathtakingly beautiful, its surface a patchwork of lush forests, crystal-clear lakes, and towering mountains. It was untouched, pristine, a world that seemed to have been waiting just for them. They touched down in a wide valley, surrounded by towering trees and bathed in the warm light of the planet's sun. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Xenia stepped out of the ship, her heart pounding as she took in the landscape around her. It was everything she had dreamed of: a place of peace, of beauty, of freedom. Luke joined her, his expression filled with awe as he looked around. "It's perfect," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Xenia nodded, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "It really is." They spent the first few days exploring the valley, mapping out the area, and setting up a temporary camp. The planet was rich with resources: fresh water, fertile soil, and abundant wildlife. It was a place where they could build a life, where they could finally find the peace they had been searching for. As the days turned into weeks, Xenia and Luke began to build their new home. It was hard work, but it was also fulfilling, each day bringing them closer to the life they had dreamed of. They worked side by side, planting crops, constructing shelter, and exploring the land. And with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger, deepening into something that went beyond friendship, beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, watching the stars twinkle in the clear night sky, Luke turned to Xenia, his expression filled with a tenderness that made her heart skip a beat. "Xenia," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I know we've both been through a lot, and I know that there's still a lot we don't know about what the future holds. But I want you to know that I'm grateful. Grateful that we found each other, grateful for everything we've built together. And I want to keep building that future with you." Xenia's breath caught in her throat as she looked into Luke's eyes, seeing the depth of his feelings mirrored in her own. She had never imagined that she would find someone like him, someone who understood her, who stood by her, who made her feel safe and loved. "I want that too, Luke," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I want to build that future with you, to live this life together." Luke smiled, a smile that was filled with all the warmth and love she had come to cherish. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Let's build that future, together." And so, under the starry sky of Valades Prime, Xenia and Luke made a promise to each other, a promise to build a life of love, of freedom, of hope. It was a new beginning, a chance to create something beautiful out of the ashes of their pasts. The days turned into months, and the valley became their home. They planted gardens, built a sturdy cabin, and explored the land that stretched out before them. They were free, truly free, for the first time in their lives. The fear that had once haunted them was gone, replaced by the quiet contentment of a life lived on their own terms. Xenia often found herself marveling at how far she had come from the frightened girl who had fled her home on Tertia, to the strong, confident woman who had faced down her greatest fears and emerged victorious. She had found her place in the galaxy, a place where she could be herself, where she could love and be loved in return. And as she stood on the porch of their cabin, looking out at the valley that had become their sanctuary, Xenia knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along, a place to call home, a place where she could live in peace with the man she loved by her side. It was a new beginning, a new chapter in their lives, and Xenia knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. Because in the end, it wasn't just about escaping Credor or finding a place to hide, it was about finding a place to belong, a place where they could build a future filled with love, hope, and freedom. And they had found that place, here, in the heart of the Valades cluster, on a planet that had been waiting for them all along. Their journey had led them here, to this moment, and as Xenia and Luke stood together, watching the sun set over their new home, they knew that their story was just beginning. A new beginning, a new life, and a future filled with endless possibilities,